The laughter was sharp, almost metallic, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers above the wedding hall. My daughter-in-law's voice cut through it all like a blade. "You look like a fat pig in that dress," she sneered, her words amplified by the silence that followed. I felt every eye on me, each one searching for confirmation, waiting for me to shrink into the floor. But instead of collapsing, I stood there frozen, a strange flicker of irony warming my chest. They thought I was powerless, a burden, someone to mock. And yet, the very man who had just walked me past the buffet, my new in-law, Gregory, had suddenly gone pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. He recognized me, though no one else did. That was the twist, the secret they would not discover until much later. My name is Evelyn Parker, and I am 71 years old. I have lived long enough to know how words can slice deeper than knives, and how silence, especially from the ones you love, can be the cruelest punishment. I raised my only son, Michael, with everything I had, sometimes with money, sometimes just with grit and stubborn love. I never wanted him to grow up ashamed of me, but shame became the quiet shadow in our house. He hated the way I dressed, the way I lived, the way I refused to pretend to be someone I wasn't. Tonight, at his wedding, I was no longer simply ignored. I was humiliated. The room smelled of roses and champagne, but to me, it smelled of betrayal. I caught Michael's eyes across the room, my son, my boy, and instead of outrage or even discomfort, there was only emptiness. He looked away, his jaw tight, as if I truly had deserved those words. That broke something in me, something old and fragile that I'd been carrying for years. What they do not know, and what Gregory glimpsed in that instant of recognition, is that I am not the pitiful, discarded mother they believe I am. I am not simply the overweight, aging widow in the corner. My life carries a weight they cannot begin to imagine, built from years of quiet sacrifice and choices they will never understand. I did not just survive after Robert, my late husband, died. I rebuilt. I took what little he left me, and I turned it into something far greater, all while living modestly enough that no one, not even Michael, suspected a thing. I stood straighter that night, feeling the burn of tears in my throat, but refusing to let them fall. The chandeliers glittered above, mocking the glitter that no longer meant anything to me. For years, I chose silence, letting others underestimate me, letting my son believe his mother was small. But silence has a breaking point. And tonight, under the veil of laughter and cruelty, the story of who I really am began to push its way to the surface. I will tell you everything about the secrets I kept, the abuse that stayed hidden behind polite smiles, the greedy hands that reached for my dignity, and the moment I finally chose to put an end to it. But before I go further, I want to ask you something, from me to you. Where are you watching from tonight? Share it with me in the comments. I'd love to know your city, your country, your corner of the world. And if my story touches something inside you, please like this video and subscribe so we can share many more truths together. The sound of their laughter still rang in my ears long after the music resumed. I tried to pretend I was focused on the sparkling glasses, the roses that decorated every table, the clinking of silverware, but none of it drowned out the sharpness of their mockery. Claire's words had been cruel enough, but what pierced me deeper was the chorus of giggles that followed from her bridesmaids and cousins. They leaned into one another like children sharing a private joke, pointing discreetly at me as though I were a circus act on display. I had spent decades teaching myself to carry humiliation quietly. Growing up poor, then building a life with Robert from almost nothing, I had endured my share of ridicule. My weight, my clothes, my hair, the way I never seemed polished enough. I had heard it all. But somehow, standing in the glow of my son's wedding, it felt different. It was as if they were branding me with shame, stamping me permanently as the wrong kind of mother to belong in their elegant family. Michael did not move. My boy, my only child, simply sat at the head table, his expression carefully arranged into a mask of calm. He did not defend me. He did not even flinch when Claire's voice sliced through the room. He stared at his plate, fork in hand, as if he hadn't heard a thing. That silence hurt worse than Claire's insult. It was the silence of a man who wanted to belong so badly to another family that he would sacrifice his own blood to keep the peace. I wondered then if he had always been ashamed of me and I had just been too blind to see it. There had been little clues over the years. The way he avoided introducing me to his college friends. How he gently asked me once not to come to his office because he didn't want people talking. I had brushed those moments aside, telling myself that all children grow distant as they chase their own lives. But tonight, the truth pressed down on me like a heavy hand. I wasn't simply distant, I was unwanted. The family of the bride, meanwhile, carried on with their cruel amusement. Claire's mother whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "Some people just don't belong in pictures." They thought they were clever. They thought I would shrink away. But then I noticed Gregory, the father of the bride, was not laughing. He was staring at me, his wineglass trembling slightly in his hand. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something but couldn't. And in that moment, I saw it. Recognition. It was as if a spotlight had shifted onto me alone, though no one else seemed aware of it. He knew me, or at least he knew of me. His eyes flickered with disbelief, and I could almost hear the questions rattling in his mind. Is it really her? How could it be? That recognition was a small flame in the middle of the storm. For a heartbeat, I felt less invisible. I was not just Evelyn Parker, the fat pig in Claire's joke. I was someone who carried a truth that could unsettle them all. Gregory's pale face confirmed it. He knew something they did not. Still, I did not speak. I held the humiliation inside my chest like a stone, heavy but unbreakable. I had learned long ago that sometimes silence is more powerful than shouting, especially when your enemy doesn't yet realize how fragile their power really is. So I smiled, just a little, and let the laughter wash over me. They thought they had crushed me, but all they had done was awaken something I had buried for far too long. Michael's silence that night was not new, but it cut sharper than ever. My son had always been cautious, always desperate to keep the peace, even if it meant letting me carry the weight of shame. Yet seeing him sit there, shoulders stiff, eyes locked on the plate in front of him, while his new wife humiliated me in front of 200 guests, felt like the final confirmation of something I had feared for years. I had lost him. When he was little, Michael used to cling to my hand everywhere we went. "Don't let go, Mama," he would whisper, even in the grocery store. His grip was sweaty, strong, trusting. I carried those memories like pearls in my pocket, stringing them together whenever life became too hard. And now, in that glittering wedding hall, he would not even meet my eyes. I was no longer the mother he needed to hold on to. I was the mother he had learned to hide. His silence was its own betrayal. Not a word, not a glance, not even the pretense of discomfort. He had chosen to belong to Claire's world, and if that meant disowning me piece by piece, then so be it. I could almost see the calculation behind his calm face. If he spoke up, if he defended me, he might lose her. And losing her, with her connections, her family name, her polished smile, was not something he was willing to risk. A flicker of anger rose in me then, not just at Claire, but at him. I had sacrificed so much to raise him, working long hours, mending old shoes, stretching soup into meals that could last for days. I had been both mother and father after Robert passed, shielding him from the cruelty of poverty with every scrap of strength I had left. And now, the son I protected would not lift a finger to protect me. The room had returned to its rhythm by then, music swelling, waiters weaving between tables, champagne flutes sparkling under chandeliers. But my world had quieted. All I could hear was the echo of Claire's insult and Michael's silence pressing against it. The combination was unbearable. I studied his face from across the room. He looked handsome in his suit, strong in his jawline, confident in his posture. He looked nothing like the boy who once crawled into my lap after a nightmare, whispering that he wanted to live with me forever. That boy was gone. In his place sat a man who found me embarrassing, inconvenient, someone better left unseen. And yet, there was still a thread of hope in me, fragile but alive. Perhaps he was simply overwhelmed. Perhaps the silence was his way of surviving the night. I wanted to believe that, even if my heart knew better. But I also noticed something else. Gregory had not taken his eyes off me. The father of the bride was shifting in his seat, restless, uneasy, stealing glances at me as if trying to solve a riddle. His discomfort grew the longer Michael ignored me. While the others laughed and drank, Gregory seemed trapped in a different reality. One where I wasn't just the mother they mocked, but someone who carried a truth too large to ignore. I held on to that. Gregory's unease became my small anchor in the storm. If my own son could not see me, at least someone in that room knew there was more to Evelyn Parker than ridicule and shame. But Michael's silence, it lingered like poison, and I knew it would not be the last time he chose others over me. Gregory's face that evening is etched into my memory more vividly than the flowers on the tables or the music that swelled behind us. When Claire hurled that insult, when the laughter rolled across the room like a cruel wave, he didn't laugh. He froze. His fork hovered above his plate, his wine glass trembling slightly in his hand, the color draining from his cheeks. It was the look of a man who had seen something he could not unsee. At first, I thought maybe he pitied me. Maybe the cruelty of his daughter embarrassed him. But the longer I studied him, the more I realized it was not pity. It was recognition. He knew me, or rather, he knew of me, and the shock in his eyes was impossible to hide. He tried to disguise it, shifting in his seat, leaning back as though nothing had happened. But I caught it. His glance darted to me again and again, almost desperate, as if trying to confirm that the woman his daughter had just called a fat pig was the same woman whose signature he had seen on the purchase documents only weeks earlier. I didn't move. I let him stew in that recognition, allowed the irony to wrap itself around us like smoke. Claire and her friends laughed at me, Michael avoided me, but Gregory knew the truth, that I was not the pathetic outsider they believed I was. I had stepped quietly into a world he thought he controlled, and with one transaction, I had become the owner of the very company he once called his empire. The music swelled louder, couples moving to the dance floor, the clinking of glasses filling the air, but Gregory barely touched his food. He whispered something to his wife, who frowned, confused, before brushing it off and returning to her chatter. But Gregory couldn't brush it off. His eyes kept sliding back to me, flickers of fear and calculation warring across his face. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. What is she doing here? Why didn't she reveal herself? Does my daughter know who she just insulted? A twisted satisfaction stirred in my chest. For once, the power was not in the polished hands of Claire's family. It was mine, and Gregory knew it. He alone seemed to understand the precariousness of the ground his family stood on, while the rest of them carried on mocking me as if they were untouchable. I leaned back in my chair, silent, sipping the sparkling water that suddenly tasted sweeter. They thought they had broken me. Instead, they had handed me the upper hand without even realizing it. And Gregory, poor Gregory, was the first to sense the storm that was coming. Still, I said nothing. The time for revelations would come, but not yet. For now, I let the insult linger in the air like perfume, because I knew the moment would turn, and when it did, the laughter of this night would curdle into shame. The irony of it all struck me harder once I remembered the truth behind Gregory's panic. Only a few weeks earlier, I had walked into a quiet conference room in the city, sat across from a group of weary lawyers and shareholders, and signed my name on a set of papers that changed everything. With the stroke of a pen, the company Gregory had once poured his life into, the one he boasted about at every dinner, the one that had given his family its reputation, belonged to me. I hadn't bought it to prove anything. I bought it because I saw its value, its potential, the way Robert would have seen it if he were still alive. My late husband always told me, "Evelyn, the best investments are the ones nobody else notices at first." He had been right then, and he was right now. The company Gregory had neglected, allowed to weaken under his pride, was the one I quietly claimed for myself. And now, here he was, sweating in a tuxedo, his daughter's cruel laughter echoing through the ballroom, staring at me as if I held his future in the palm of my hand. He wasn't wrong. I could almost taste the bitterness in the air. Gregory's reputation was already fragile. Whispers of bad decisions and debt had circled for months. But the others in that hall, his wife, his daughter, his polished circle of friends, didn't know that their fortunes now dangled on the thread of my choices. I had the power to keep the company steady, or let it sink completely. The beauty of it was that no one else at that wedding had a clue. Claire still smirked at me with smug superiority. Her friends were too busy sipping champagne and adjusting their designer dresses. Michael? Well, Michael sat silent, too eager to impress them all to notice the storm brewing only a few seats away. They thought they were laughing at the weakest woman in the room. In truth, they were laughing at the one person who could unravel them entirely. I kept my face calm, neutral, though inside I burned with a mixture of rage and quiet triumph. There was poetry in the way humiliation and power sat side by side that night. They called me a fat pig, but Gregory couldn't meet my eyes without flinching. They dismissed me as worthless, yet I held the deed to their pride. The chandelier lights reflected off the glasses, casting golden shadows across the room. Somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized I no longer wanted revenge in the way they might expect. What I wanted was dignity. Mine, reclaimed after years of being the quiet, overlooked woman. And perhaps, just perhaps, I wanted them to understand the price of underestimating me. Gregory shifted again, his fingers drumming nervously against his wine glass. And I knew. The insult they thought would destroy me had actually given me leverage I hadn't planned to use so soon. I couldn't sit in that wedding hall without my mind slipping backward, back to the days when life was simpler, and everything I had was built with my own 2 hands beside Robert's. He wasn't just my husband, he was my partner in every sense. Robert had calloused palms from years of labor, but his mind was sharp, always turning over ideas, searching for ways to build a future out of scraps. We didn't have much in those early years, just a small apartment and a baby boy who cried through the nights, but Robert never let me believe we were stuck. He used to say, "Evelyn, wealth isn't just money. It's how you play the long game." And he lived by that. When a neighbor offered to sell us a failing hardware store for almost nothing, Robert saw an opportunity. I thought he was crazy at first. We had barely enough to buy groceries, but he convinced me to take the leap. We scraped together every penny, sold the few valuables we had, and bought it. That little store became the seed of everything else. Robert worked sunup to sundown, and I worked right beside him. I handled the books, the orders, the customers who came in with more complaints than coins in their pockets. Slowly, painfully, the store started to grow. And when the time came, Robert sold it at the perfect moment, turning that humble beginning into the first real profit we'd ever seen. From there, we kept building. Small real estate projects, smart investments in local businesses, partnerships that no one thought would amount to anything. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Every dollar was earned with sweat and sleepless nights. By the time Robert passed away, we had quietly accumulated a fortune. Not billions, not anything that would make headlines, but enough to change lives. And yet, I never flaunted it. I wore the same comfortable dresses, lived in the same modest house, and clipped coupons at the grocery store. To the world, I was ordinary, invisible, and honestly, I liked it that way. Michael never knew the full story. To him, we were just getting by. I didn't want him to grow up spoiled or entitled, so I hid the truth. I thought I was protecting him, teaching him humility. But now, as I sat in that glittering ballroom, watching him pretend not to see me, I wondered if my silence had backfired. Maybe he had mistaken my modesty for weakness, my discretion for failure. Maybe he had grown up ashamed of the very sacrifices that made his life possible. The ache of that realization was heavier than any insult Claire could throw at me. She didn't know my story, but Michael did, or at least he should have. He had seen me patch his jeans late at night, make meals stretch when there was almost nothing left, pay his tuition without ever letting him know how hard it was. And yet, In this room, he chose her laughter over my dignity. I thought of Robert then, his steady voice in my ear, telling me to stand tall. "You're stronger than they'll ever understand, Evelyn. You always have been." His absence felt like a wound all over again, but his words were still there, holding me up when no one else would. The truth was, everything they thought they could take from me, respect, pride, dignity, had already been forged in fire long before this night. I had survived worse than their cruel words, and soon enough they would learn that the woman they mocked was the woman who held their future in her hands. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It creeps in quietly, day after day, like water seeping under a floorboard until the wood rots. That was how Michael's distance grew over the years. Slow, subtle, hidden behind polite excuses and practiced smiles. I remember the first time I felt it. He was in his early 20s, freshly graduated from college, so full of ambition and nerves. I drove for hours to surprise him at his new apartment with groceries and a homemade casserole, the kind of thing any mother would do. He opened the door, looked at me, and instead of joy, I saw panic in his eyes. His roommates were there, polished and proper, and I realized in that instant he didn't want them to see me. He hugged me quickly, whispered something about bad timing, and I left with the casserole still warm in my arms. I told myself it was nothing. He was young, trying to fit in, desperate to be taken seriously. But it didn't stop there. Every holiday visit became shorter. My phone calls went unanswered more often than not. When we did speak, he seemed impatient, distracted, as though my stories from the past were nothing more than clutter in his busy life. And then came Claire. She was beautiful, polished, with the kind of smile that could charm anyone in a room. Michael brought her over for dinner one evening, and I cooked every one of his favorite dishes: pot roast, cornbread, apple pie. Claire barely touched the food. She picked at her plate, complimented the effort with a thin smile, and later I overheard her telling Michael that my house smelled old. From that night on, the distance widened. Michael began visiting less. When he did, it was always rushed, always with Claire at his side, her polite but distant tone filling the space. He rarely came alone anymore. I became a shadow in his life, someone acknowledged out of duty rather than love. The small favors I had always done, slipping him money when he was short on rent, helping with his first car, sending care packages, were forgotten, swallowed by the silence of his new priorities. The cruelest part wasn't the absence of his presence. It was the absence of his defense. Every time Claire made a cutting remark about me, about my clothes, my house, even the way I laughed, Michael never corrected her. He never stood up for me. He let her words hang in the air like facts, as if I truly was the embarrassment she painted me to be. It became clear over time I was no longer his family. I was a relic, tolerated only because he couldn't quite erase me. The mother who had once been his entire world had become the woman he avoided introducing, the voice he ignored on his phone, the weight he carried into rooms where appearances mattered more than loyalty. That night at the wedding, when he sat in silence while Claire called me a fat pig, it wasn't a new betrayal. It was simply the loudest echo of all the silent betrayals that had come before. Years of swallowed pride, years of letting myself believe he would come back to me, all crystallized in that moment. And yet, beneath the ache, there was a spark of something else. Anger, yes, but also clarity. For so long I had allowed Michael to write the story of who I was in his eyes, embarrassing, unworthy, invisible. But sitting in that golden ballroom, surrounded by laughter that wasn't meant to include me, I began to wonder if it was time to reclaim my own story, whether he wanted to see it or not. After the vows were spoken and the photographs staged, the reception swelled into a blur of dancing, laughter, and endless glasses of champagne. I tried to keep to myself, but I could feel Gregory's eyes following me like a shadow across the room. He wasn't enjoying the party. His smile was brittle, his shoulders tense. Every time his gaze met mine, he looked away just as quickly, as though burned. It didn't take long before he found an excuse to approach me. I was standing near the far wall, pretending to admire the towering wedding cake, when he appeared at my side. "Mrs. Parker," he murmured, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "A word, if you don't mind." I nodded, though my chest tightened. We stepped away from the music and chatter, into a quieter corner near the exit doors where the faint scent of cold night air slipped in with every passing waiter. Gregory's face was pale under the dim lights, his hand tugging nervously at his cufflinks. "I need to ask," he began, his words careful, heavy. "Are you Evelyn Parker, who just purchased Northbridge Industries?" His eyes darted, scanning my face, as if hoping I would laugh and tell him he was mistaken. I didn't. I simply met his gaze. "Yes." One word, steady and calm. His mouth fell open slightly before he recovered, clearing his throat and forcing a stiff smile. I didn't realize," he stammered. "No one said—" "Why would they?" I interrupted gently. "I've never been the kind of woman anyone here notices." The silence between us carried more weight than the string quartet playing in the background. I watched as the realization sank in deeper. The woman his daughter had mocked in front of everyone was now his superior, the owner of the company that had once defined his pride. "I thought you were—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Less?" I offered, tilting my head. His face flushed. He didn't answer. There it was, laid bare between us. He had always seen me as invisible, and now that invisibility had turned into power. He tried to mask his discomfort with courtesy, muttering something about hoping we could speak more formally in the future. But I could see the fear in his eyes. His daughter might have won a husband, but she had no idea she had insulted the very woman holding her father's livelihood in her hands. As he excused himself, adjusting his tie, I stood still, letting the irony settle over me like a second skin. For years I had been silent, enduring the quiet scorn of others. But tonight, their cruelty had collided with my secret in the most perfect way. And Gregory was the first to realize it. I wasn't powerless. I was the storm on their horizon. When the music picked up again and the dance floor filled, I returned to my seat. The laughter had shifted, no longer sharp but muffled under the pulse of the band. Yet the sting of Claire's words lingered in me, like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Fat pig. 2 little words, spat with such casual cruelty, as if I were nothing but an object to ridicule. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, staring at my reflection in the polished silverware. My cheeks, softer with age. My body, no longer slender as it once had been. My dress, simple compared to the glittering gowns around me. For a moment I almost believed her voice, almost let it write the story of who I was. But then, memories crowded in, memories that made those words ring hollow. I remembered being 17, sitting in a high school cafeteria where the girls with painted nails whispered about me behind cupped hands. I remembered a neighbor once laughing when he saw me fixing a broken fence alone after Robert passed, calling me a poor widow playing at being useful. And I remembered the way Michael, as a teenager, begged me not to come to his basketball games because he said the other kids made fun of me for being too loud, too noticeable. Those insults, the OAS dismissals, had carved scars into me long before Claire was even born. And yet, I had survived them all. I had gotten up the next morning, gone to work, paid the bills, raised my son, and kept breathing even when life seemed determined to crush me. The truth is, the insult at the wedding didn't just hurt because it was cruel. It hurt because it carried every other insult I had ever carried, all bundled into a single moment of public shame. And worst of all, it was delivered not by a stranger, but by the woman my son had chosen to marry, the woman he allowed to speak for him. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the music wash over me, letting the tears burn but not fall. There was power in refusing to cry, in refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I reminded myself that I had lived through worse storms than this. My dignity was not theirs to strip away. It was mine to reclaim. Somewhere across the room, Gregory was still watching me. He knew. He alone had seen the truth hidden beneath the insult. And while his eyes flickered with unease, Mine steadied with resolve. Claire's words would not define me. They might echo for a time, but soon my own voice would rise above them. And when it did, no one in that golden hall would be laughing anymore. The memory of that day at the law office still feels sharper than the wedding itself. The room had smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the air-conditioned silence broken only by the shuffle of documents across the table. I sat in a plain navy dress, nothing special, the kind of outfit that never draws attention. My lawyer slid the final contract toward me, the pages thick and heavy with signatures waiting to be added. "Mrs. Parker," he said quietly, "once you sign, the transfer is complete. You will officially be the sole owner of Northbridge Industries." I took the pen in my hand, and for a moment I hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of memory. I could see Robert's face as if he were sitting right there with me. His steady smile, the way his brow furrowed when he was thinking hard. He would have been proud, I knew that. But he also would have told me to keep my head down, to let others underestimate me. That was always his philosophy. Let them laugh, let them doubt, and then quietly prove them wrong. So I signed. One slow, deliberate stroke after another, my name filling the empty lines. When the last page was complete, the room seemed to exhale around me. The company was mine. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about survival and strategy. I had studied the numbers for months, seen the cracks Gregory had ignored. He had been too proud, too certain of his own brilliance to notice how the ground beneath his company was crumbling. Where he saw a burden, I saw potential. Where he clung to the image of success, I built an actual one. When the papers were stacked and sealed, the lawyers congratulated me with polite smiles, as though they couldn't quite believe the quiet woman before them was capable of such a move. I thanked them softly and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the city humming around me. No one stopped, no one pointed. I was invisible to the world, and that invisibility was my armor. Walking back to my car that day, I had felt a strange mix of power and loneliness. Power because I knew what I had just secured. Loneliness because there was no one left to share it with. Michael didn't know. He had never asked about my life beyond what it gave him. And Robert was gone, leaving me to carry his voice only in memory. And now, sitting at his wedding, listening to Claire's insult echo through my mind, I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. Only weeks before, I had become the owner of Gregory's pride and legacy. And now here I was, mocked openly by his daughter, as though I were nothing more than a poor, overweight widow who didn't belong in their golden circle. If they had known the truth, they would have held their tongues. But part of me was glad they didn't. There was power in their ignorance, and I intended to use it wisely. The first time I walked into Northbridge Industries as its new owner, I felt the weight of every step. The lobby was grand but tired, marble floors dulled by years of use, a chandelier that no longer sparkled the way it once did. Employees moved briskly through the halls, their eyes on the ground, the atmosphere thick with unspoken worry. They had no idea the company had quietly changed hands, that the woman they passed in the elevator was now signing their paychecks. I remember spotting Gregory across the atrium that day. He was talking to a group of middle managers, his voice booming with the same authority he always carried. But when his eyes met mine, something faltered. He froze mid-sentence, the color draining from his face. For a heartbeat, I almost pitied him. This had been his world, his sanctuary, and in one stroke, I had taken it from him. He approached me quickly, his steps stiff, his smile forced. "Mrs. Parker," he greeted, voice tight. "I wasn't expecting you here today." "I'm sure you weren't," I replied evenly, holding his gaze. "But you'll be seeing me often now." There was no need to elaborate. He knew exactly what I meant. His handshake was clammy, his eyes darting toward the others around us, desperate that they didn't overhear. What struck me most wasn't his fear, but the silence of those watching. They noticed the tension, the cracks in his composure, and though they didn't know the details, they sensed a shift. That was the moment Gregory realized his position had changed forever. He was no longer the unquestioned authority. He was a man working under the woman his daughter had humiliated at her wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had entered quietly, with no fanfare, no grand announcement, but my presence alone was enough to unsettle him. I didn't need to shout my authority. I only needed to stand in that lobby, calm and steady, while he scrambled to adjust to his new reality. After our brief exchange, I walked past him and into the conference room. I could feel his eyes on my back, heavy with anger and disbelief. The walls of that building had once echoed with his pride. Now they whispered with his fear. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat at the head of the table, opened my folder, and began discussing the future of the company. But inside, I carried the memory of that wedding night, the insult, the laughter, and the way Gregory's face had turned pale in recognition. That moment had been the spark. This was the fire. Rumors have a way of spreading faster than fire in a dry field. It didn't take long before whispers about me began trickling through the edges of the family. At first, it was small things. Claire's cousin mentioning that Gregory had looked strange around me at the wedding, or one of the bridesmaids noticing the way he avoided my gaze. But soon, the story twisted, grew teeth, and began to move on its own. I heard from an old neighbor that Claire had been making comments, saying she suspected I was hiding something. She didn't know what, not yet, but she could sense there was more to me than I let on. That suspicion became her obsession. Claire had always been the kind of woman who couldn't stand not knowing everything about the people around her. Secrets, to her, weren't mysteries. They were threats. Michael, meanwhile, tried to brush it all off. He called me one afternoon, his tone casual, almost rehearsed. "Claire thinks you might be wealthier than you let on," he said, as though he were commenting on the weather. He laughed nervously, but underneath, I could hear the hunger in his voice. He wanted it to be true. He wanted me to confirm it. I didn't. I simply told him what I always told him, that I lived simply, that I didn't need more than I had. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. The truth was too dangerous to hand over so easily. Still, I knew how these things worked. Families like Claire's thrived on gossip, and the more they whispered, the more they began to look at me differently. No longer was I just the embarrassing mother-in-law. I became a puzzle, a riddle that gnawed at their pride. Who was this woman they had mocked so openly? Why did Gregory look like he'd seen a ghost when she walked into the room? I caught Claire studying me once during a family dinner, her eyes sharp and calculating. She smiled sweetly, but it was the kind of smile that hides knives behind the teeth. She asked innocent questions about my house, about whether I traveled, about my old investments. Each question was dressed in politeness, but I could feel the claws beneath the velvet. I stayed calm. I answered little. I let her stew. The more she tried to pin me down, the slipperier I became. And in that silence, in that refusal to give her what she wanted, I grew larger in her mind. The rumors had begun to shift the balance. I was no longer just invisible Evelyn Parker, the woman to laugh at. I was something else now, someone to watch, someone who carried a secret big enough to unsettle the foundations of her carefully constructed life. And Claire was not the type to let a secret go. It was Michael who came to me first, not Claire. He called one evening, his voice unusually warm, the kind of tone he hadn't used since he was a boy, asking for a second slice of pie. I could hear the hesitation in his breath before the words finally tumbled out. "Mom, I need a little help." At first, I thought he meant something small, something ordinary, a bill maybe, or some expense from the wedding. But as he kept talking, the truth bled out. There were debts, credit cards maxed out, and whispers of loans he had taken in Claire's name. Their perfect lifestyle, the parties, the trips, the glittering image they worked so hard to maintain. It was all borrowed, built on sand. He tried to make it sound casual, as if everyone lived like this. "It's just temporary," he assured me. "We'll bounce back soon. But if you could, maybe help us cover the gap." The words stung more than I expected. Not because he was asking for money. God knows I had given him plenty over the years without him even realizing it. But because he said, us. He wasn't asking just for himself. He was asking on behalf of Claire, on behalf of the same woman who had called me a fat pig in front of 200 people. I thought of all the times I had slipped folded bills into his jacket pocket when he was younger, just so he wouldn't feel embarrassed in front of his friends. The countless sacrifices Robert and I had made so he could go to college without worrying about tuition. The nights I stayed awake at the kitchen table, balancing numbers, making sure there was always enough for him, even if there wasn't enough for me. And now, here he was, not a boy anymore, but a grown man, still looking at me as a solution, not a person, still seeing me as a safety net to catch him when he fell. I listened quietly, my heart pounding. He tried to laugh, tried to soften the request with jokes, but I could hear the edge in his voice, the desperation he was trying so hard to hide. This wasn't just a gap. This was a hole, and it was pulling him under. "Michael," I said softly, "you're asking me to save you from choices you made without me." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then came the words that cut me deeper than I care to admit. "So, you're really not going to help me? After everything I've done to make you proud?" Proud. That word twisted in my chest like a knife. Did he really believe I had ever been ashamed of him? That all I ever wanted was his performance, his success, his shine? No, I had wanted his love, his loyalty, his respect. And instead, here he was, asking for money as though that was the only language between us. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I realized the truth. My son didn't see me as a mother anymore. He saw me as a bank. A mother turned into an ATM machine, useful only when spitting out cash. After I hung up the phone with Michael, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the wood grain as though the answer to my dilemma might be carved into it. My son was drowning in debts, manipulated by a wife who despised me, and yet the decision wasn't about numbers or checks, it was about dignity. Mine, his, ours. For years, I had convinced myself that giving was the only way to keep him close. If I filled his gas tank, he would visit. If I slipped him cash for groceries, he would call. If I covered his tuition, he would stay connected. But each gift only stretched the distance further. The more I gave, the less he saw me as a person. And now, I stood at a crossroads, give again, and confirm my role as nothing more than a mother-ATM, or draw the line and risk losing him completely. The temptation was strong. I could easily have written a check, cleared the debts, smoothed over the cracks in his carefully constructed life. No one would even know. It would be simple. Too simple. But inside me, a quiet voice resisted. That voice had been growing louder ever since the wedding, ever since Claire's insult had stripped the last of my patience. It whispered of boundaries, of respect, of reclaiming something I had surrendered too many times. I thought of Robert again. He had always admired my strength, even when I couldn't see it myself. "Evelyn," he would say, "if you bend too far, people forget you can break." Had I bent so far for Michael that he no longer even recognized me as his mother? The house was silent around me, the clock ticking steadily in the corner, every second sharpening my decision. I knew what Michael expected, for me to give in, for me to save him once again, no questions asked. But I also knew what that would cost me. Not just money, but the last shreds of my dignity. Finally, I whispered aloud, as if to test the words, "No more." The sound startled me. It was firm, steady, a voice I hadn't used in years. Not the voice of a woman begging to be loved, but of one demanding to be respected. The next time Michael called, I would have to tell him. I would have to look my son in the eye, or hear his silence on the phone, and say the words he never expected from me, that I was done being used, that I would no longer trade money for crumbs of affection, that if he wanted me in his life, it would have to be on the terms of love, not transactions. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I was not just a mother enduring abuse in silence. I was a woman drawing a line in the sand. And once that line was drawn, there would be no going back. I wasn't wrong about Claire. The sweetness she wore at the wedding, those polite smiles, the careful way she greeted me after her insult, was nothing but a mask. Behind it lived a woman who needed control, who thrived on power games. And once suspicion about my finances took root, she couldn't let it go. It started with subtle questions. "Evelyn, you live alone, right? That house must be a lot to manage by yourself." Or, "Do you ever think about downsizing? I mean, if you sold, you'd have, well, a comfortable little nest egg." Each question was framed as casual concern, but her eyes betrayed her, sharp, probing, like knives wrapped in lace. I gave her nothing. No details, no numbers. I knew better. Silence, after all, was my greatest shield. But Claire wasn't the type to be satisfied with silence. When charm failed, she turned to strategy. I found out through a neighbor that Claire had hired someone, an investigator, discreet but clumsy enough to leave traces. Bank statements, property records, even old business partnerships with Robert. She was digging into my life as though she had a right to it, as though marrying my son gave her access to everything I had fought to build. The revelation didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how calculated it all seemed. Claire wasn't just curious. She was building a case, preparing for something bigger. She had married Michael not out of love, but out of calculation. And now she was looking for her payoff. Michael, of course, was blind to it. He told me once that Claire was just curious, that she wanted to make sure the family was secure. Family. That was the word she used, as if I weren't part of it, as if I were an outsider who needed to be evaluated before she could decide my worth. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and thought about how far things had fallen. My son had married a woman who not only despised me, but also saw me as prey. And worse, he was too blind or too eager to please her to recognize it. Still, I let her dig, let her waste her money on investigators and lawyers, thinking she was clever. Because every record she uncovered would only confirm what I already knew. I wasn't just financially secure. I was far beyond what she could imagine. And when the time came, when her greed finally overstepped, I would be ready. For now, I stayed quiet, biding my time. Silence was not weakness, it was strategy. And Claire had no idea that the more she searched, the closer she came to unraveling her own future. The proposal came on a warm Sunday afternoon, dressed in sugar but dripping with venom. Claire invited me to their apartment, insisting it would be a cozy little family lunch. I knew better than to believe in coziness where she was concerned, but I went. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing, and part of me wanted to see what game she was playing. The table was set too perfectly, linen napkins folded like swans, wine glasses sparkling in the sunlight, dishes that looked as though they had been cooked by someone other than Claire. She greeted me with that same polished smile, all warmth on the surface, her eyes cold and calculating beneath. "Evelyn," she said as we sat, "we've been thinking a lot about family lately, about how important it is to build something lasting, something bigger than ourselves." I said nothing, just let her talk, my fork moving slowly across the plate. She launched into her speech like a politician, every word rehearsed. She spoke about legacy, about responsibility, about how families like theirs thrived when everyone contributed. And then finally, she revealed the core of it. "We want to start a new company," she said, her hand brushing Michael's arm as if to anchor him. "A family-owned venture, something we can all put our names on. With your experience and your resources, we could build something extraordinary together." There it was. She didn't even try to hide it. She wanted my money. Not in hints or questions, not through whispers behind my back, but out loud, wrapped in the ribbon of family. Michael nodded, looking at me with a hopeful expression, as if he truly believed this was a noble idea. He didn't see the greed glittering in his wife's eyes. Or maybe he did, and he simply chose to ignore it. I set my fork down carefully, folded my hands, and looked at her. "And what exactly do you imagine my role would be?" I asked softly. Claire's smile widened. "Well, you'd provide the foundation. 50 million to start, maybe more once we're established. Michael and I would handle the operations, the vision. You could be part of the board, of course, but really, This would be about the next generation carrying the torch. 50 million. She spoke the number as casually as if she were asking me to pass the salt. My son's eyes lit up at the mention, though he quickly tried to hide it. My chest tightened as I realized just how far I had let him drift. I didn't respond right away. I simply sipped my water, the silence stretching long enough for Claire's smile to twitch at the edges. She wanted me to rush in, to agree, to prove her theory that I was wealthy beyond measure and easy to manipulate. But silence is its own answer, and in that moment, I gave her nothing. What she didn't know was that her little proposal had already sealed her fate. She thought she was clever, but she had only revealed the depth of her greed. And I would no longer play the part of the silent, obedient mother. The meal ended with polite words and forced laughter, but the decision in my heart was already made. Claire had drawn the line. Now it was my turn to show her what lines I could draw. The night I finally decided to confront Claire, I didn't come armed with anger. I came with truth. I had gathered every document, every scrap of proof I needed. The investigator's report she had commissioned, the debts her family had buried under layers of pretense, the evidence of how far she had gone to pry into my life. I laid it all neatly into a folder and tucked it under my arm. When I arrived at their apartment, Michael opened the door looking surprised. "Mom," he said, his voice caught between warmth and unease. "We weren't expecting you." "No," I replied softly, stepping inside. "I know." Claire emerged from the kitchen, her smile practiced, her tone syrupy. "Evelyn, what a nice surprise. We were just talking about—" I held up the folder and placed it on the coffee table, cutting her words short. "Talking about this, perhaps?" Her eyes flicked to the folder, and for the first time, her mask cracked. Michael frowned, glancing between us. "What is this?" he asked. "Proof," I said simply. "Proof of what Claire has been doing behind your back, hiring investigators, digging into my accounts, searching for ways to claim what isn't hers, and proof of her family's debts so deep they're drowning." The room fell silent. Michael's face tightened as he reached for the folder, flipping through page after page. His hands began to shake. Claire tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. "Evelyn, really, this is unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" My voice sharpened. "You called me a fat pig at your wedding, Claire. You humiliated me in front of everyone. And still, you thought you could come to me with smiles and schemes, as if I were too weak to see through you." Michael looked up then, his face pale. "Claire, is this true?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. For once, the woman who always had a retort, always had a plan, was speechless. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You may think I am invisible, that I am nothing but a quiet old woman too soft to fight back. But you are mistaken. I have lived through more storms than you can imagine, and I will not let my son's life, or mine, be swallowed by your greed." Michael's eyes darted to hers, then back to me. The room felt heavier than stone, the air charged with the weight of truth finally spoken. Claire stood frozen, her hands clenching at her sides, her mask shattered into jagged silence. For the first time, she understood. I wasn't the one trapped. She was. And as for Michael, his face told me he didn't know whether to feel betrayed by his wife, ashamed of himself, or terrified of what would come next. Michael sat slumped on the couch, the folder of evidence spread out before him like the ruins of a life he didn't know he'd been living. His hands trembled as he picked up each page, reading the cold truth in black and white. Claire's investigator's bills, the legal consultations she had tried to hide, the documents that laid bare her family's debts. Every sheet of paper was a blade, cutting through the illusions he had clung to. Claire, meanwhile, had gone from silent to desperate. She paced the room, her voice rising in pitch. "This isn't what it looks like, Michael. I was only trying to protect us, to secure our future. Don't you see? Your mother has been hiding things from you. She's been keeping you in the dark." Michael's face hardened. "And that justifies lying to me? Spying on her? Using me to get to her?" His voice cracked, the anger barely masking the hurt. Claire reached for his arm, but he pulled back. The panic in her eyes was almost feral now. She was losing control, and for a woman like her, that was the ultimate humiliation. I stood quietly, watching the mask crumble. For years, I had been on the receiving end of her cruelty, her smug glances, her whispered insults. Now the truth had stripped her bare. There was no polish left, no perfect smile to shield her. Only greed, raw and exposed, clinging desperately to the illusion of power. Michael dropped the last page back into the folder with a thud. He pressed his palms against his eyes, his shoulders shaking. "I can't believe this," he whispered. "I defended you, Claire. I believed every word you told me about Mom, about how she was holding us back. And all this time, it was you. You were the one using me." Claire's voice cracked as she tried again. "Michael, please, you don't understand. Without me, you'd have nothing. My family, your family," he snapped, finally looking at her with a fury I had never seen in his eyes, "is drowning in debt, and you married me to keep your head above water." Her face twisted, caught between rage and desperation. "So what if I did? At least I had a plan. What has she ever given you besides shame?" She pointed at me then, her voice shrill. "She's nothing but—" "Enough," Michael barked, his voice sharp enough to silence even her. He turned to me then, his eyes wet, filled with something that looked like regret. For the first time in years, he didn't look past me, he looked at me. The room went quiet, thick with the sound of Claire's breathing and Michael's broken silence. And in that stillness, I realized the balance had shifted. Claire's power had shattered. Michael was no longer her shield. The masks were gone, the pretenses burned away. All that was left was truth, and the raw, painful reckoning that comes with it. For most of my life, I had believed that endurance was love, that bending, giving, and sacrificing without end was what made me a good mother. But standing in Michael's living room, watching the woman he married unravel under the weight of her own greed, I finally understood that endurance without limits was nothing but self-destruction. I turned to Michael, my voice steady, though my hands trembled at my sides. "I will not be used anymore, not by Claire, not by you. I am not a bank. I am not a doormat. I am your mother. And if that means nothing to you unless money comes with it, then we are finished." The words hung in the air, heavier than any silence I had ever endured. Michael flinched as though I had struck him. Claire, standing near the door, opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, stopping her cold. "Do not speak to me again," I said, my tone sharp enough to slice through her desperation. "You forfeited your place in my life the moment you called me a fat pig in front of my own son." Her face twisted, but she stayed silent, perhaps realizing at last that there was no more leverage to grasp. Michael's lips parted, searching for words. "Mom, please. I didn't know. You didn't want to know," I interrupted. It was easier to believe their lies about me than to stand beside me. Easier to laugh at me in silence than to defend me. Easier to see me as a wallet than a woman. Tears filled his eyes then, and for a fleeting moment, I saw my little boy again. The one who used to cling to my hand, who begged me not to let go. But the man before me had let go long ago. And now, I finally had the courage to release him too. "I am done," I whispered. "I will not carry this abuse in silence any longer. If you want a relationship with me, it will be built on respect, not money. If not, then this is goodbye." The strength in my voice surprised even me. It wasn't anger that steadied me. It was liberation. For the first time in years, I was standing tall, not waiting for scraps of love, but reclaiming my dignity. Michael bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, but he didn't chase me as I walked toward the door. Claire stood aside, her face pale and tight, the reality of her failure finally sinking in. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt lighter. I had lost something that night, yes, but I had also regained something far greater, myself. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost eerily so. For the first time in years, my phone didn't buzz with Michael's hurried requests or Claire's veiled criticisms. The silence, once a punishment, became a gift. I could breathe again. My mornings were no longer weighted by dread, wondering what new demand or insult would arrive. Instead, I poured coffee, opened my windows, and let the sunlight fall across my kitchen table like a promise. I knew the family whispered about me still. Claire's relatives spread their own version of the story, painting me as cold, ungrateful, selfish. Let them, I thought. Their words no longer had the power to break me. I had faced humiliation in a crowded ballroom and walked out with my dignity intact. That was the victory no rumor could erase. Gregory never reached out, though I heard through quiet channels that he resigned from Northbridge Industries shortly after. He couldn't stand the shame of reporting to me, couldn't face the employees who knew the company's crown had slipped from his head. His pride had always been his fortress, and when it cracked, he simply disappeared behind the rubble. Michael, on the other hand, tried. He sent messages, hesitant, halting apologies that arrived too late. "Mom, I didn't know. I should have said something. I never meant to hurt you." The words were there, but the weight was missing. Love without respect is not love at all, and respect had been absent for far too long. I read his messages, then closed my phone without replying. Sometimes silence is the only answer left. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired, yes, but underneath the exhaustion was something purer: peace. For the first time since Robert died, I felt like I was living my life for myself, not for anyone else's approval or affection. I began investing in projects that mattered to me: small community programs, scholarships for young women who dreamed of becoming engineers like Robert once had. I called it the Parker Fund, not out of vanity but out of love. His name deserved to live on, not in dusty photo frames, but in futures bright enough to outshine our hardships. And as for me, I traveled. I stood barefoot on beaches Robert and I once talked about visiting, sat under wide desert skies where silence wasn't loneliness, but freedom. I rediscovered what it meant to belong to myself. The night of the wedding had been cruel, but it was also a beginning. It stripped me bare, forced me to face the truth of my son, my in-laws, and myself. And in losing their approval, I found my freedom. I am Evelyn Parker. I am 71 years old. I am no longer a mother defined by shame or a woman dismissed by appearances. I am a survivor, a builder, a woman who chose dignity over silence. And this is my re-beginning. When I look back now, I see the night of that wedding not as an ending, but as the hinge on which my entire life turned. Painful, humiliating, unforgettable, but also necessary. Because until you are stripped bare in front of the world, until the people you love most show you exactly where you stand, you cannot know the strength that lies inside you. I was called a fat pig by my own daughter-in-law. My son sat silent while the room laughed. For years, I would have bent under that cruelty, swallowed it like every other insult I had endured, and convinced myself that love meant enduring. But that night, I chose differently. I chose to stand tall. I learned that silence can protect, but it can also imprison. I had hidden my fortune, my strength, my voice, believing modesty was a shield. In truth, it became a cage. That night, I broke it open. Not by announcing my wealth, not by humiliating them in return, but by reclaiming my right to dignity. My story is not about money, though money was the tool fate put in my hands. It is about boundaries. About the courage it takes to tell even your own child, "Enough. I will not let you use me anymore." About the moment you stop measuring your worth by the eyes that look past you and begin measuring it by the strength that carried you through every storm. Michael will always be my son, and part of me will always love him. But love without respect is a wound that never heals. So I carry on, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He must walk his own path now, free from my money and free from my silence. And I too am free. To anyone listening, maybe you've been dismissed, mocked, treated like you were small, or used only for what you could give. Hear me. You are more than their laughter, more than their cruelty, more than the role they force upon you. You have the right to demand respect. You have the right to draw a line and say, "This is who I am, and I will not be less." My life now is quieter, but richer in ways that matter. I invest in young people with dreams, in communities that need hope, in futures brighter than my past, and I live with the certainty that I am no longer invisible because I refuse to be. So I ask you, with all the honesty I can give, where are you watching from tonight? Share your city, your country, your corner of the world with me. Leave me your thoughts in the comments, and if my story has touched you, please subscribe for more stories of life, resilience, and truth. If you feel moved, you can also support through Super Thanks. It helps keep these stories alive. And if you're looking for more, watch the other videos waiting for you on this channel. See you in the next life story with love and respect.